Right, my first video for a while, and something not very different, but a little bit different. We are at the Havilland Museum, just off the M25. You can hear it in the background. And been here before. Nice little museum. Be here for a couple of hours probably. And so let's go and see what we can see. So in this hangar, they are restoring a DH-89A, which is a Dragon Rapide. You often see them flying over the house. They do pleasure trips from Duxford. Can't see much of it in here apart from the wings. I do not remember this, because it's a marquee, being here last time I came. So I've always been able to bring a few things indoors, or outdoors perhaps. Some bits from sea venom. Some further parts from a sea hornet. Some of the aircraft are parked outside. I'm sure they'd love to get them inside. They have built a new hangar a few years back, which you'll go into shortly. I suppose there's not a room for everything. Anyway, so there's a Vampire. This was a trainer version without hood on. There's a British Aerospace 146. I think they used to take off from City Airport. Maybe still do. But the Havilland DH-125, the executive jet, the successor to the Dove, which I think might be behind, I'm not sure. These aircraft used to be open. It may just be because it's off season, but they're all shut up now. Here is the Havilland Heron, dating back to the 1950s. This is the Havilland Dove. It's a Mark 8, manufactured from 1960 to 1968. So we have a Heron to the left, and a Dove to the right. I've already forgotten what this one is. I have to put it in the below. Here's the front section of a Hawker Siddeley Trident. I'm sure you should go on that. Unfortunately, not now. There's a Sea Vixen being restored. Must be tricky outdoors. I do have a picture of one of these flying, not this one. If I can find it. It's up there somewhere. The aircraft we saw on the grass all used to be in this area behind me. But a few years back, they built the hangar, which you can see over my shoulder, which we shall be going into shortly. This is what we come to see, how we're going to save this bit to the end. But these are the Mosquitos, a very famous aircraft from the Second World War, of which I believe they've got 3 in here, and one of which is the initial original prototype. But we'll leave that bit to last. Here's something interesting. It's the concrete moulds used to mould the shape of the fuselage for the Hornet, which was a wooden construction, and they did exactly the same thing for the Mosquito. From up here, we can see half of the new hangar they built. Here we see the ill-fated Comet. A hornet moth. So a replacement for the tiger moth. This one dates back to 1935. As you see here, the autogyro. This one dates back to 1931. This is the Havilland Queen Bee, which interestingly is a drone dating back to 1935 and was indeed the first drone. This is a replica DH-88 Comet. These were built for the McPherson Air Race in the 1930s from England to Australia. This one's a replica, but I've actually got pictures of the Grosvenor House version. I think 3 were built, and 1 still flies at Shuttleworth. And I'll post a picture of that up there somewhere. Here is a cockpit section of the Sea Venom. And I think we can go and have a look. Here is the Havilland Vampire, first of the British jets. This one dates from 1949, but the Vampire first flew in 1943. I think we have a look inside this one as well. Not a lot of room in there. This is the Havilland Chipmunk. I've seen many of these flying.
Now, being a very hard-working man and a perfectionist, as with most things, he would make it as good as he could. But these Renault engines, he didn't like at all. You know, take other manufacturers' car engines to bits, find the best bits, make them even better. But he thought, rather than modify a Renault engine, he would build his own. So he designed his own engine, used the V format, and used the layout of his standard car engine, the straight 6, made it a bit bigger, and came up with a couple of engines, the Eagle, which was 21-litre bomber engine, and the Falcon, which was slightly smaller, principally for fighters, and they were both successful. Even after the war, the Eagle engine gained a bit more fame when it powered the Vickers Vimy across the Atlantic, the first aircraft to do so non-stop. And said Vimy was initially intended to go all the way from Newfoundland to England. They didn't quite make it all the way, but they did make it across the pond. But due to various reasons, as they approached the Irish coast, it was decided they were going to put down in Ireland, not least for the weather reasons, but they were looking for somewhere sensible to land, somewhere wide and green. They found something that looked suitable, put the aircraft down. It came to a very rapid halt and stood on its nose because they landed in a bog. So Captain Alcock and Lieutenant Brown climbed out relatively unhurt, and eventually the aircraft and the crew made their way separately back to England. The aircraft, if you wish to go and see it, if you haven't already, it now resides in the Science Museum in London, up on the top floor in the Aviation Gallery. And it's alongside another couple of very famous aircraft, not least Amy Johnson's Gypsy Moth, but a little bit further up there's another aircraft I'll talk about in a minute, became very significant in the genesis of the Merlin engine. So after the war, Henry Royce continued making cars and aircraft engines, and in the mid-20s he designed an engine which was rather bigger. He could see the need for engines of greater power, and he designed the Rolls-Royce Buzzard, and this was a mere 37 litres. So it was a bit of a monster, but it became very significant in the Schneider Trophy contests. Most people heard of it. Anybody not heard of the Schneider Trophy? Set up in 1913 by Jacques Schneider, a French businessman, for marine aircraft, because he had the idea that air transport, when it eventually got going, would be mainly by marine aircraft. His reckoning was that the world is covered 71% with water, so that will provide an endless supply of landing grounds and takeoff grounds, of course. He was almost right for a while. It didn't eventually work out the same, but his concept was it would develop marine aircraft. So he specified it's purely for flying boats and seaplanes. And if you're not sure what the difference is, a flying boat lands on its hull or fuselage shaped underneath like a boat. But a seaplane is more or less a standard airframe, but with floats underneath instead of wheels. And he specified that if anybody or any country, the international race, won the contest more than 3 times in a row, then, or 3 times in a row I should say, that nation would keep the trophy, the Schneider Trophy, in perpetuity, and it would be the end of the series. And the 4 main competitors, Germany being excluded by the Versailles Treaty of course, were France, Britain, Italy and the USA. As I said, it started in 1913. There were 2 contests before the war, restarted in 1919, not terribly successfully. 7 aircraft were entered. 3 of them didn't turn up to fly in the race. 3 of them dropped out on the first lap, and only left 1 aircraft, an Italian one, and he was disqualified for flying the wrong course. It wasn't actually a race, aircraft versus aircraft, it was actually against the clock. So it's the British aircraft that won. Italy subsequently won it twice, was setting up for a 3rd one, but the Americans stopped them. They then won it twice. We'd had a couple of wins. In the mid-20s, it was largely getting down to Brits versus Italians. So up until then, the British aircraft had been powered by the Napier Lion, which was, by the mid-20s, was getting rather old and a bit lacking in power compared to its competitors. So the Air Ministry came to Rolls-Royce again and said, what can you do with your Buzzard engine? And they were already actually developing it to try and make it more powerful. Initially, it produced 950 horsepower, which wasn't a bad going for the mid-20s, but they wanted even more power. Up until then, as I said, most of the aircraft had been designed by Supermarine, as their name implies, marine aircraft. And in the mid-20s, their chief designer was a certain Reginald J. Mitchell. And he came up with a new design, a seaplane rather than a flying boat. His previous 3 designs for the competition had been flying boats. He came up with the S4, which was not terribly successful. Came back the next year with the S5, and that was better. But for the next attempt, this is now 1927, and at this point, the competitors went to the organiser and said, can we have 2 years between competitions instead of 1, because it's taking longer and longer to develop aircraft and engines. That was agreed, but it gave Rolls-Royce a bit longer to develop the Buzzard engine, and they managed to get it up to 1900 horsepower, and that went into the Supermarine S6 for the 1929 competition. So 27 was the S5 with the Napier Lion. Supermarine S6 was the racing engine, which wasn't called the Buzzard for this because it was so heavily modified for racing. It was just known as the R for racing. And a lot of the improvements were in the inside of what went on inside the engine, not necessarily the capacity, that remained the same, but great improvements were made in the supercharging. The supercharger was mounted on the back of the engine to improve the pressure of the air and fuel mixture going into the cylinders. Now, it was a V12, like all of Rolls-Royce's engines have been, aero engines have been up till then. And as I said, they got it up to 1900 for the 1929 race, and Britain won that one. So that was 2 in a row. So 1931 was going to be the crunch. So they wanted to make it even more powerful. So they took the test engines back to the Derby Rolls-Royce works, and they were running this engine day and night to get as much power out of it as possible, find all the modifications they could make. They employed a specialist for the superchargers. He made numerous improvements, a chap called Stanley Hooker. And as I said, they were running the engines day and night, and they were using 3 other engines, 2 to keep it cool, because it was producing prodigious amounts of heat, as you can imagine, and 1 to extract the exhaust fumes from the test shed. All this noise, 24 hours a day, didn't go down too well with the populace around the factory. But when they told it was all for Britain, they sort of put up with it for a while. Anyway, they got the engine up to 2,200 horsepower. And come the final competition, what a giveaway, in 1931, it was really down to a straight contest between Great Britain and the Italians. Now, the Italians had come up with a very novel idea for their seaplane, the MC-72. They put 2 engines in it, not both driving a separate propeller, because they were sat one behind the other. So effectively it made a V24, but in between the engines was the fuel system, and that was their downfall, unfortunately. It was so complex that it kept giving them major trouble, and during their practice, in the advance of the race, one of the aircraft blew up, killing the pilot, and the second one suffered a similar fate. Unfortunately, the pilot survived this one. He managed to land the aircraft, but that was them out of the contest. So it was going to be a walkover for Great Britain. So they could have gone around the course around the Isle of Wight at any speed they wanted. But no, they went round at racing speed, and the contest was won by George Stainforth. He was member of the RAF high-speed flight, which had been formed almost specifically to win the Schneider Trophy, which they did in 1931. And just to rub salt into the wound, the boss of the high-speed flight went out in the S6B, which was the modified S6, put up for 1931. And this is it. Beautiful looking seaplane. And as I mentioned earlier, it's sitting up in the Science Museum on the top floor. It doesn't have its Rolls-Royce racing engine in it. It's way too heavy to hang from the ceiling. But his boss had said 1931, a week after the race, went out and broke the world airspeed record, as the S6 had done after the previous contest, pushed it up to 407.5 miles an hour. Makes an interesting comparison with the first Schneider Trophy, in which case the winning aircraft had gone round the course at 45 miles an hour average. Quite a contrast. Anyway, all the development work that went into this racing engine went into Rolls-Royce's next design, which was originally known as the PV12, and Henry Royce set about designing this in 1933. Initially, being a period of depression, the government wasn't too keen to give lots of money away to another aircraft engine. However, when they saw what it could do, they agreed, and it was given a bit of government sponsorship, and it was also given a name for Merlin. Now, you may have noticed that all the Rolls-Royce aero engines I've mentioned up until now are named after birds of prey. So the name of the Merlin engine has nothing to do with magic or wizards. It's named after a small falcon, which was apparently much favoured by Tudor ladies for hunting. So the size of the bird has nothing to do with the size of the engine, which in the case of the Merlin is 27 litres, so a little bit down from the Buzzard and the racing engine, and a bit bigger than the Kestrel engine, which was the engine used to cool racing engines, which went back to the 21 litre format. Henry Royce put a lot of effort into designing this, and as I said before, he was a very hard worker, perfectionist, and he effectively worked himself to death, poor chap, and he died at the end of 1933, so we never got to see the Merlin engine fly. He heard it run, but it didn't fly until 1935 in a Hawker Hart light bomber, and that was followed by the first production engines that went into the Fairey Battle single-engine bomber. Shortly after that, a Hurricane prototype flew, the Hawker Hurricane, end of 1935, followed the next year by the Spitfire, designed by R.J. Mitchell, who put all his expertise gained with the racing seaplanes into the design of the Spitfire. So initially the production engine, the first Merlins, pushed out 1,030 horsepower, so that went into the early Hurricanes and Spitfires and the Battle. And all the improvements throughout the war were, again, not change of capacity, but all the innards of the engine undergone, changes with the supercharger and so on, the airflow through the engine, and they pushed it up to, by the end of the war, somewhere around 2,000 horsepower. There are racing versions around at the moment in America, which I think have gone up to 2,300 or something, which is not bad going. This engine is a Mark 25, and it was fitted originally in a Mosquito FB6, like this one behind me. That's one of more than 20 different types of aircraft which were powered by Merlins. The famous 4 or 5, if you can count the Mustang. Hurricane and Spitfire, of course, as I mentioned, the Mosquito and the Lancaster. Now, the Lancaster nearly didn't happen. It started life as the Everett Manchester, which was powered by a Rolls-Royce engine, but not one of the successes. It was actually called the Vulture, and it was 2 of their other engines, Peregrines, mounted one on top of the other, making an X24. And like the Italians' double engine, it was very complicated and kept catching fire. So Avro, who designed the Manchester, weren't terribly happy, and they made a request to have Merlin engines instead. Oh, and by the way, could we make it 4 per aircraft? And that was agreed. So basically what they did was lengthen the wings of the Manchester to make room for the outer pair, and minor changes to the airframe, and that became the Lancaster, so that Britain's best 4-engine bomber during World War II. This one, though, as I said, fitted in a Mosquito. I did mention the Mustang. That was powered by the Merlin, or as it was known to the builders, the V1650, because it was built by Packard in America. And that happened because the War Ministry wanted, or the Air Ministry wanted somewhere that wasn't going to get bombed in terms of factories, so they went to America and initially asked the Ford Motor Company, and Henry Ford said no, because he had business interests in Germany. So Packard took on the mantle of building the Merlin in America, and they actually changed the production technique. Rolls-Royce started with a team of 10 men. They would build one complete engine, send it on its way, start on another one. Packard changed the production technique to production line, as they did with their luxury cars. They didn't do sort of hand finishing as Rolls-Royce did. They made everything the right size to start with. They reduced the number of bolts that were or different types of bolts, sizes of bolts, from 6 with Rolls-Royce down to 4 or even 2, and made it much quicker to build. So they turned out a goodly number of engines. In fact, of the total number of Merlins that were built during the war, which was 168,000, Packard made 55,000 of them. And that went into the North American Mustang fighter, initially powered by an Allison V12, but when the RAF ordered the Mustang, they didn't like the Allison engine, so they asked for it to be re-engined with the Merlin, which it was with Packard-built Merlins. Made sense, building everything in the States and then flying it across to Britain. Anyway, back to this engine. I said it was the starboard engine of an FB6 Mosquito, operated by 418 Squadron, which was a Canadian manned squadron of the Royal Air Force. There were several Allied manned squadrons similar to them, and they'd been tasked with going out at night over the English Channel and shooting down flying bombs. Now this took place literally a matter of days after Germany had started launching flying bombs, a couple of weeks after D-Day. And if you don't know what a V1 looks like, that's the V1 flying bomb, or doodlebug. So, very small. If you look at the model there, you can see, compare it with the figure in the end of the launching run with that, you can see it's probably about a quarter of the size of the average fighter aircraft. So quite difficult to see even in daylight, but at night they had to rely on the ground radar stations spotting them, and then the navigator's job would be to look down out of the cockpit. You stand up beside the pilot looking down, and having found one of these things with the help of the radar, they would position behind it. They'd be up at about 5,000 feet. The flying bombs would be down at 2,500, 3,000 feet, doing about 400. They position behind the flying bomb, try and overtake it. When it disappeared under the nose, they go into a dive to pick up a bit of extra speed, stabilise behind the bomb, and open up with all 8 guns. That's 4 20mm cannon, 4 machine guns, and hopefully destroy the flying bomb. Now there's always a risk, of course, when you're shooting at a bomb with 1,000 pounds worth of explosive, not 1,000 pounds worth, weight, that thing's going to explode. Well, they'd had a go at 2 and hadn't even hit him. Third one, they did hit it. Wasn't third time lucky, because although the warhead didn't explode, the bomb broke up and a lot of debris came back and hit this engine, which promptly itself burst into flames. So the pilot understandably broke off the attack and put the Mosquito into a climb to try and regain some of the height they lost in the attack. And he shut the engine down, so he pulled back the RPM and the throttle and pulled back the feathering lever. And now that feathers the prop. Is everybody familiar with the term feathering? Some are, some aren't. I'll show you what it does then. Feathering it. So this is what happens when the pilot pulls back the feathering lever. The blades rotate. See all the gubbins happening in there. So the blades are now in line with the airflow. So the idea is that's causing minimum drag. So he's now down onto one engine in the climb, having shut down this engine and put the fire out. It is possible to unfeather the feathered prop, but not when the engine's been on fire. It's not a good idea. Anyway, so there they are, climbing up towards as high as they can get. Just as they're levelling off, the left engine starts playing up, because that had taken some damage, and the propeller control unit leaked all its oil away. So there's nothing now controlling the blade angle, and under various forces, aerodynamic and centrifugal, the blades went round to fully fine. Now that, with the airflow driving them now, because he tried to shut the engine down, cut off all the fuel, the prop is now spinning, driven round by the airflow, and that creates a heck of a lot of drag. and the engine is probably over speeding as well. So it's well above the normal 3,000 RPM. So he's really got a handling problem on his hands. The aircraft is trying to yaw off to the left all the time, so there's loads of drag on the left, no drag on the right. Very difficult to fly, so he's probably had to increase the speed up from the 140, which is the glide speed of the Mosquito, and he's had to get the rudder to give it enough effectiveness to keep the aircraft going straight. By now, of course, they're heading for land. They have no wish to jump out into a cold, dark, wet English channel with very little likelihood of being picked up. So he's coming down at a fair old speed, a fair old rate of descent. Fortunately, the radar station's still got them on, and he's able to tell them when they've crossed the coast. They're getting quite low by now, so as soon as they're over land, navigator bails out. He's already standing by the hatch with his parachute on. Come the word, he goes to jettison the hatch. That doesn't come out because it's been damaged as well, so he had to kick the door out. He bails out, pulls his parachute, lands safely on the South Downs. He's followed fairly closely behind by the pilot, who jumps out of his seat. Unfortunately, in his haste, he catches his foot on the control column and pushes it forward, which lowers the nose even more, but not for long, because he leans back, pulls it back as far as he can, pulls the nose up just to check the descent before he jumps out, and he goes out breaking all the rules that aircrew are taught. You don't go out holding on to the ripcord, and you definitely don't pull it before you get out, because that's game over. And once you're outside the aircraft, you count 3 to make sure you're clear of the aircraft, and then you pull it. He jumps out, pulls it straight away. Not a problem from the prop on out there beside him, because it stopped anyway. His parachute opens, he's only under it for a matter of seconds before he hits the ground. He later reckoned he bailed out somewhere between 300 and 500 feet. So that's pretty close to the ground. Bearing in mind the aircraft is probably coming down at over 1,000 feet a minute. So it's a matter of seconds. So much so that the aircraft hits the ground at about the same time he did, only a matter of a few hundred yards ahead of it. So it really was cutting it fine. So he hits the ground hard, collapses, having jarred his shoulders and his legs. So he's lying on the ground trying to get his breath back, at which point the aircraft has just hit the ground, burst into flames and ruptured the fuel tanks. The left engine was probably hot, very hot, having been running over speeding. So everything's burning away, and that does what's known as cooking off the ammunition that's left in the guns. So with bullets and shells flying everywhere, Pat McGale, the pilot, and this is him, decides he's going to lie there, doesn't want to be shot down by his own ammunition. Very good idea. Eventually gets up to his feet and makes his way a bit painfully away from where he's landed and goes looking for a farmhouse, carrying his parachute bundle up. He eventually finds a farmhouse, knocks on the door, the farmer eventually comes, lets him in, and he asks to use the phone to phone his base, which he does. They're now sitting there having a cup of tea, and there's another knock on the door, and it's his navigator who found his way down the hill, thankfully to the same farmhouse. So they eventually make their way back to RAF Ford, which was a few miles further north, and they landed about 6 miles north of Shoreham, the aircraft had hit the ground in the valley of the River Adelon. And anyway, the crew make their way home, get debriefed, and get checked out by the medics, given a couple of weeks off to get over their ordeal, and then come back to the squadron. They carried on flying for the rest of the war and eventually returned safely and happily to Canada. And the reason we know all these details about their ordeal is that years later they were tracked down and asked to tell the story, because an aviation archaeology group had found the crash site, or heard about the crash site, and came looking for wreckage. There wasn't much left on the surface, but they got a pretty good echo from this thing, on their metal detectors, so they started digging and digging and digging, and got fed up with digging with shovels, having not got to anything. So they called in a JCB and eventually came to this engine 25 feet below ground. So having hit the ground at probably well over 150 knots, it had kept going in the clay of the river valley. So they brought it up and cleaned it up a little bit, and it eventually ended up here in 1989, 1990, where our engineers set about restoring it and getting it back turning again, which they did. It makes an interesting comparison, this engine having hit the ground at, say, at a relatively low speed. If you compare it to that engine which sits underneath the tail of the Mosquito over there, that one hit the ground probably doing about 300 knots, maybe even more, and it hit a railway embankment, which was pretty solid, unlike the clay of the river valley. So this one came off rather better. Another reason for the fact that it's still turning was the fact that it wasn't running when it hit the ground. So basically we've got the V12 here. Our engineers have left the top end off this one so you can see the pistons moving. You'll notice the two central pistons are working together, as are the two outer ones and the two in between, working in pairs, not doing the same thing at the same time. Of course, if you're familiar with the four-stroke cycle, you'll know it well. Suck, squeeze, bang, blow. So suck is the piston going down, pulling in the fuel and air mixture. Squeeze is coming up again, compressing the air and fuel. Bang is when the spark plug is fired. It then burns rapidly and expands. That's the power stroke. And finally, you've got the exhaust stroke, the piston coming up again to get rid of the exhaust fumes. Now, these pistons not doing the same thing at the same time, and similar things happening on the other side, of course. You'll also notice the camshaft, single overhead camshaft, driving two valves, two exhaust valves, two inlet valves per cylinder. And this piece of kit here is the magneto, one of normally two. There should be another one on the other side, and they give it dual ignition. So this magneto is powering one plug per cylinder, and the left-hand mag would be doing the same thing. Now, these would all be checked before flight, so switches up for magnetos. So the pilot before takeoff would sit at the side of the runway, put the requisite RPM up to warm the engines up, and then he would switch one mag off, and what he'd be looking for was known as drop no stop. So you'd expect a drop in RPM because one set of plugs isn't firing, so it would drop, 1 or 200 RPM. And if it stopped, of course, when he switched one mag off, it meant the other one wasn't working. Hence drop no stop. He then did it with the other mag and the other engine, so he'd know that everything was working satisfactorily. Now those switches aren't actually connected to anything. So they're there for show. Right, enough talking. I'll kick it into life. As you say, you'll see the pistons going up in pairs. The spark plugs, our engineers have kindly put the red bits in so you can see which plug is firing when. Don't ask me what the order is, it's far too complicated to remember. But those spark plugs are still actually working. And if you look very carefully, you'll see the little tiny blue flash at the top. I can only run it for about 10 or 15 seconds because it doesn't have its own oil supply, so it's going to be fairly short and sharp. But you'll see everything whizzing up and down. Those of you at that end, you'll see the front left piston where the crankcase is broken away. And all the gubbins on the side here still working. This is the starter motor link. Rolls-Royce incidentally provided all their Merlin engines with a starting handle. And indeed, initially the Hurricanes, when they first entered service, had to be started by 2 ground crew with this great big starting handle. Anyway, enough talk. Bit of engine noise, but it's only a clatter from the electric motor. So here we go. Nobody videoing it? Right, I'll give you a countdown then.
She's going.
Right, 3, 2, 1. Put my hand over that spark plug hole, and you may have heard the hiss. I think the thing was going around. So it's still producing a fair amount of compression. If anybody wants another run, I'd be quite happy to give another short burst. Seen enough? Not quite heard the rest, because that's not a very impressive clatter. This one is. When it really starts. Finest noise in the world, especially when there are 4 of them. But there we are. If anybody has got any questions, I'll try and answer them. But there we are. That's the Rolls-Royce Merlin.
Right, this is the Dragon Rapide. We see these flying over the house sometimes. There's a couple flying out of Duxford on pleasure trips. This one says Hillman Airways. I've got a feeling they used to operate from Maylands. I'll have to look into that. Maylands is a golf course now, but it was originally an airfield, and I think the first sort of international flights to Paris took place from Maylands. Well, I've just checked, and Hillman Airways did indeed operate from Maylands. And Hillman's used to live in Main Road, Goodyear Park. So a bit of a local connection there. Right, we're just about to go on to the Comet, and the earlier Comets, of which this is one, had a habit of crashing. So a couple disappeared very soon after they introduced, and they didn't understand why they were crashing. So they put the fuselages under pressure test, and as you can see here, you can see the fuselage cracked at the windows, and the windows were square. And they sort of learnt that square windows and high pressures wasn't a particularly good idea. So the later ones all had round windows or oval windows. So we're on the Comet. This was a French one. Start again. So we're on the Comet. This was a French built one. That was one of those used in the pressure testing to see why the planes crashed. This is the only original square window one left. And they've taken away some of the cladding, so you can see how they were built. The Comet was the first commercial jet airliner. Unfortunately, being the first, they discovered things which were unknown at the time, which was the metal fatigue caused by the pressure on the corners of square windows. I don't know if you can see it there, but there's a photo and a model of the pressure testing facility. Essentially, they filled it up with water and pressurized it until it cracked, which it did. There were no luggage holds at the time. All the luggage was just put in a big, essentially a cupboard at the front of the aircraft. Here's the cockpit. Here is a horse glider which transported troops used on D-Day, Pegasus Bridge, Arnhem. Here's the inside. As you can see, constructed from wood. And this is what we've really come to see, de Havilland's most famous aircraft, the Mosquito. None flying in the UK, unfortunately. I think there's one in New Zealand, maybe one in the States, I'm not sure. But there are 3 in here, including, I believe, the prototype. This is the prototype of the Mosquito. Something very unique. The Mosquito was one of the fastest aircraft of the Second World War, made of wood. Unfortunately, it turns out my spare battery is flat. So, I don't think I'm going to get many pictures of these, which is what I came for. Anyway, this is the prototype. This one is the fighter bomber version. This particular example was built in 1945. This is a Mark 35 bomber version from April 1945. It was too late to see service in the war. This is the wreckage from a Merlin engine from a American Mosquito, which unfortunately crashed and hit a railway embankment, which unfortunately did neither the engine or the crew any good. Both crew members were killed.